2025 elections are fast approaching, and arguably, this could become the most consequential midterm elections in contemporary Philippine history. In fact, it could become the first midterm elections where geopolitics, US China rivalry, not to mention growing tensions between the House of Marcos and House of Duterte, could become a major bone of contention. The nexus between foreign policy and domestic politics will be likely more pronounced in the upcoming elections than any time in recent history as far as Philippines is concerned. To better understand the intensifying conflict between the Marcos dynasty and the Duterte dynasty and how it connects to the West Philippines disputes and US-China rivalry in this part of the world, let's talk to someone who understands these issues more intimately. In fact, let's also discuss what are the prospects for the liberal oppositions and progressives and other forces who are also vital to a pluralistic democracy in the Philippines. Is there hope for the traditional opposition? What should the liberal and progressive opposition do in order to matter in the upcoming elections, if not having a good chance of winning offices? Or is this just going to be a competition between the administration-backed candidates and the de facto opposition, namely Duterte's and their allies? Let's talk about this. Senator, thank you very much again for joining us. In the previous episode, actually, I thought we were going to go through things quite seamlessly, but the more we had this conversation, the more I realized there are many dimensions to this. Now, I understand this is a very sensitive issue, and perhaps we need to have much more thorough even investigation and discussion about this. But what I want to also understand here is, what is your read of China? Because I think, ang basa ko sa conversation natin in the previous episode is, ang daming fault lines domestically. To be honest, if I can use the term, medyo sabog pa yung internal strategic processing natin, policy making natin. But what is your read of China? You were saying that China was also in a transition phase from Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, and back then very few people knew that Xi Jinping would be the Xi Jinping that we know today.
Yes.
What is your experience of dealing with China back in the day, and what is your read of China today compared to then?
Okay, the primary difference is we were dealing with Hu Jintao. They're now dealing with Xi Jinping. Okay, and back then, if we had internal squabbling or some domestic issues during that time, they also had domestic issues in their background, because there was a faction in the
Communist Party
the Communist Party of China who wanted to stop the ascension of Xi Jinping. And this is the
Bo Xilai,
Jiang Zemin.
Chongqing faction.
Okay. So that's why they wanted to de-escalate the situation, because the faction, the rival faction of Xi Jinping was using the Scarborough incident as an incident to showcase the weaknesses of the Hu Jintao administration. So they wanted it to de-escalate so that they can now proceed with their transition of power. And again, as you mentioned, Richard, nobody saw that the Xi Jinping then
it was an unknown figure,
would turn out to be the Xi Jinping now, because they said he is Western educated, he's more sophisticated and
princely,
but he has a more moderate approach in internal and external politics. So that was the situation then. And so the assumption was he will just carry over the Deng Xiaoping, eventually Hu Jintao philosophy. But obviously, the whole world was mistaken.
Bide your time, hide your claws kind of strategy.
So, and it was the US who belatedly realized that. So that's why in 2017, they shifted their foreign policy understanding and approach towards China from a mere economic rival to a national security concern.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, just over a year after your sensitive negotiations with China,
You have Xi Jinping consolidating power over the Central Military Commission, over the state, over the party. And then by end of 2013, they start this massive reclamation project, which by all indications even caught America off guard. And initially everyone was dismissive about it, but I think over time it became clear that this is something consequential and transformational in strategic terms. Now, the other thing I want to understand here is, so from the previous episode, you were saying you did your job of making sure we don't go to war, and there's a, by facts of logistics, sequential disengagement. We didn't challenge it for some domestic bureaucratic reason, if I can put it that way, which we can have a long conversation about separately. But the thing is, the arbitration happens, and it ends on a very strong note, perhaps more optimistic. Even the most optimistic analysts didn't see such a sweeping victory. Now, one thing I heard from some senior military officials during the Duterte administration, because we had conversations with them back then as a bunch of scholars who were trying to understand what's going on, is this argument that we needed a soft landing. And the soft landing obviously could be interpreted as, nagsusurrender kayo sa China. But the national security understanding of that was the Chinese were really threatening military intervention if we asserted the arbitration award in 2016 when it came out in mid-July. If you remember, they sent a nuclear-capable bombers near Scarborough Shoal. They were doing some drills in the area. Was it really that dangerous by then? Because you're arguing that Xi Jinping turned out different from Hu Jintao. But how different? Was he so different that in 2016 there was a real threat of military confrontation? Or this is just, for the lack of a better term, hanash, right? This is just drama to justify the soft pedaling, if I can put it, of the Duterte administration.
I believe it's just a pretext of their compromised position. They needed to justify why they are turning pro-China. So they're dangling this this threat of an invasion and war. That's why they need to kowtow to the whims of China. But I believe it's because Mr. Duterte was compromised from the very start. He was a Manchurian candidate, and he was there. And he benefited from that financially. His Davao group benefited from these big-ticket projects that eventually they entered with China. So, walang connection.
Do you think there should be an investigation? Because the argument would be, what is your evidence to say he was a Manchurian candidate? I mean, he won fair and square the 2016 elections. All surveys show that he was very popular. There was no lack of effort on your part to expose him for all of his real, the real side of his politics.
The evidence was Duterte himself in his public speeches. Remember, he wanted just to stress a point, he wanted China to make Philippines its province. You don't joke about these things, because he is the president, he's the sole architect of foreign policy, and he said he wants to join China in its ideological flow, right? He was bringing the Philippines to China, and that is the evidence. These are foreign policy pronouncements. Okay. Now, the sudden or the rushed was this of China to reclaim the islands, because they had this mistaken notion that by doing so, they will now be exempted from the
they create facts on the ground.
Yes, the provisions of UNCLOS. They thought that these are now islands and therefore are entitled EEZ. But then, even the biggest island in the Spratlys, Ituaba, which is being held by Taiwan, is not even classified as a self-sustaining island. Therefore, is not entitled to its own EEZ. So that negated the whole thing. But I believe yun ang intention nila. Kaya nila pinaspasan yung mga reclamation doon. They thought they would be able to preempt any decision from...
so you think that was a trigger?
Yes.
That creating facts on the ground, kind of a de jure reality on the ground.
This is it. They were... they may be formations before, reefs, but now it's an island. Therefore, they can now get a favorable ruling. But Fortunately for us, that wasn't the case. And the arbitral tribunal decided in favor of the Philippines by negating the 9-dash line assertion of China.
What do you tell to the Duterte folks' argument that his approach was successful in the sense that there were no major crises similar to what we're seeing in Ayungin Shoal right now? Obviously, that means they're just going to completely ignore what happened in the Reed Bank. But but I already kind of answered. But what is your read on that? Did Duterte's strategy of being nice to China and in exchange, I think this is almost verbatim. If you're meek and humble, you will get China's mercy. Is this what happened during Duterte in the South China Sea
No, no.
and West Philippine Sea?
Well, hindi nangyari yan because remember, 'di ba, may niram nga na fishing boat. There were harassments. Yung mga fishing boats natin, hinaharas doon. May water cannon incident pa rin. Hindi nila nakuha.
Na-publicize?
Yes.
You were saying there was always a kind of gag order on showing the real bullying on the ground.
And may naram na fishing boat, 'di ba? Lahat ito nangyari during Duterte's time. And may gag order sa AFP and nililik lang sa amin, no? That's why we were getting it out pa rin.
I remember.
I think yun din naman yung credit dun sa mga defense officials during the Duterte administration na talagang nababother sila dun sa sell-out approach ni Duterte. So to answer your question, no, hindi tayo nakakuha ng relative peace during that time because we were still being taken advantage of during the Duterte administration by China, both in the West Philippine Sea and internally, domestically, di ba? They got yung dito communications. They were able to have them installed inside military camps.
Facilities, yeah.
You cannot be more sell out than that. Diba? You're looking for evidence there is your evidence.
And in terms of, but you could also say he was just foolish. Say he was just naive, right? Yeah. That's being too nice in your opinion. But your understanding is that the defense establishment somehow held the line because the alliance with the U.S. still held towards the end. In fairness naman to AFP and Philippine Navy, they didn't publicize a lot of things because of the gag order perhaps, but it's not like they didn't do any patrols and all, and they didn't pass down information to make sure people know what's happening on the ground, right?
Yeah. Well, the prohibition against patrols were maintained. Because it would be a defiance of an order. So for the first, I think up to 2020, the EEZ patrols were suspended. And so there's that. Then I believe it's still the culture. The members of the armed forces, the officer corps in particular, have this natural alliance or for that matter, komportable sila at ease sila with the U.S. and allied countries, even schooling-wise.
May rapport and all, yeah.
Duterte, in fact, opened this scholarship program or academic
with PLA,
exchange with PLA. So officers were now undergoing schooling in China.
Indoctrination.
But the language divide and the culture. I think
trust divide, I would say.
You can set that aside because if you send an officer there, there is no initial distrust. They just they tried to study, but they can't because of the language
and culture,
and the culture. So in the end, they still want to go to the U.S. for schooling. That's so Duterte wasn't successful in co-opting the armed forces towards China.
Now, there are many hypotheses on Marcos' foreign policy pivot, some would say recalibration, reboot, whatever you want to call it. What is your understanding of what happened with Marcos? Was it that Marcos Jr. was inherently of a different understanding when it comes to the China challenge? Was it a question of him for electoral and political reasons sounding a little bit different, but once he was the president, he was more of himself? Was it also because of what China and U.S. offered him, or what China did not offer him? How do you understand suddenly this EDCA expansion? I mean, you go from Duterte putting kind of restrictions on EDCA implementations, not allowing Americans to preposition weapon systems, and then suddenly Marcos comes in, all implementation full, but also add new bases. What do you think was the trigger, or was it a series of events that led him to that decision?
Okay. Well, to be honest, all of us assumed from the previous opposition that he would continue the foreign policy position of Mr. Duterte. And analyzing everything now in hindsight, I think it's more of what you said, the latter part of what you said about the sequence of
Right.
events. It's what China didn't offer him and what the U.S. offered him.
Yeah.
And I think he decided based on that, and not a preconceived foreign policy position during the campaign that was carried over. No.
So you think he has been tactical, situational, right? He reads the situation, looks at the balance of forces. So like a very rational leader, ito ang kailangan natin. It looks like China is not taking us seriously. We have no leverage. Do you think that China also read him? Let's just be honest. Do you think that China bought the Duterte argument that he's a weak leader, that he doesn't have his own mind on things? Maybe China also was listening to the wrong advice on the new president?
I totally agree with that. They misread him. They assumed that the team unity was forged in principles and policies. That's why they treated or they gave weight to the relationship with the Dutertes than create a new relationship with President Marcos. So I think they erred in that regard.
Before we go to the upcoming elections, because I mean, in many ways you could say this could be the first elections whereby foreign policy fault lines could be a major. I mean, obviously, gut issues will always drive voters. We're not exaggerating foreign policy issue, but I think this is where you're going to see team arguments like, oh, we're Team Philippines, you're Team China, or we're Team Philippines, you're Team US. You're going to have those kinds of debates soon. But before we go there, can you tell me also a little bit about your understanding of the United States? Because, I talked to people who worked during the Aquino administration, throughout different administration. We talked to former President Ramos, among others. One of the things that comes out from our conversation is that and Americans themselves would always also tell you that, some of them at least, that we were taken for granted at some points. I think even during Aquino's time, President Aquino, one reason why he was very strong on Japan and others is because he felt we're not being given the kind of importance that we deserve given the scale of things. I mean, what is your understanding of the United States? Has it evolved in terms of its foreign policy? Because Obama was very wishy-washy also on, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. I mean, that was quite dismissive of the Scarborough crisis.
Okay. I believe there is a longer historical context behind this.
Right.
I think the Americans were hurt when the Philippine Senate kicked out the U.S. bases back in 1992. So it is a stigma that they weren't able to recover from until decades later. So that's how we were treated. Then during the time of President Aquino, it was the rebooting or the rebuilding, because during the time of GMA, remember, GMA withdrew from the coalition of the willing, and again the U.S. Have validated their fears about the Philippines as an unreliable ally.
Yeah.
So during the Aquino administration, there was a reboot of that relationship. So the rebuilding of trust. So the EDCA was one big step, but then the Dutertes came, and it was a relapse. So I think doon tayo ngayon eh. Kaya kailangan natin itong time na to under the Marcos administration, ito na yung biggest opportunity for re-strengthening that relationship with the US and that rebuilding of trust. Kasi yun nga, no, yung sinasabi, how come we're not getting modern equipment or sophisticated modern equipment from the US?
I mean,
It's-
Jordan gets it.
Yeah.
Pakistan. I'm not talking even about some advanced allies. I'm just talking about even relatively poor non-allied nations. They have very advanced. They have F-16 fighters among other. Why not the Philippines? The argument would be.
So yun na nga, no? Imagine mo, under the Dutertes, paano mo naman? Why would you give them US equipment na compromise na talaga? It's a pro-China government. So ngayon pa lang, pwede. But still, baby steps kasi baka mamaya 2028, balik na naman tayo sa pro-China president. So kumbaga, kailangan pa nating mag-stabilize until
So you're saying we have to be a mature, reliable ally? Because in countries like Singapore, I think the expression is they're friends that act like an ally, right? Because technically Singapore is not a U.S. ally, but they're a very reliable partner in terms of logistics, in the Changi port facilities and all. I understand where you're coming, although my reading is also, I think there was also a lack of appreciation of this Philippines' need for really stepping it up. I mean, I always use the term strategic scouting. It's like yung nakikita mong talent na medyo rough diamond pa, may mga sablay ba here and there. But you rather invest in that player because one day it could be big. That's my understanding of the Philippines. But I agree with you. May unreliability problem din on our part, yeah.
But then, yung sinasabi mo naman na under-appreciation of the needs, that's the role of the government,
The
Philippine
diplomacy,
government. Manghingi tayo. Di ba? Yun naman Pagka hindi ka nanghihingi, ba't ka bibigyan? Di ba? So, ngayon, nanghihingi. So, that's why may papasok na mga na funding from the US to beef up our security sector. So, ganun lang yon. That's how
Yeah,
it
I mean,
goes.
we saw in the trilateral after there was a bipartisan push also in parallel for quadrupling almost our foreign military financing. In over 5 years, we're looking at $2.5 billion. You dealt a lot with Senator Marco Rubio, among others, throughout the years. What was your understanding of your interaction with them? Were they telling you, come pressure us more to help you more? I mean, was there, what is your understanding? Because U.S. Congress is very important to get the funding. We see that in Ukraine. We see that, with their allies in the Middle East, among others.
So, when I dealt with them, it was during the Duterte administration.
Right.
And because of the human rights situation,
Tipid
talagang
tayo, oo.
cancel tayo,
Yeah,
X tayo.
yeah,
And
yeah,
they wanted even to cancel the aid sa AFP, but I really lobbied to stop na cancelin yon kasi sabi ko yung AFP naman hindi
Hindi
naman
involved sa drug war.
so
Yeah.
ni-retain yon, pero yung PNP talagang beyond salvation kasi it was used as the instrument of oppression. So yun yung naging problema niyan, but they were willing, lobbying lang yan. And right now si President Marcos is the fair-haired boy of the US. He can get
Enfant
what
terrible,
he can actually get what he would wish for.
And you think, Senator, that the Philippine community is like 5 million strong in the U.S. maybe can up its game? Because we see very strong lobby by the Indian community, among others. You think the Filipino community in the U.S. should also step up its game to lobby, to pressure the Congress
Yes,
and the
but
government?
but the problem right now is because of the upcoming elections, may mga Filipinos na pro-Trump So hindi pa rin
But isn't that a good thing that if ever Trump wins,
yon.
mayroon pa rin tayong linkages?
So
I
doon
mean,
pa
yeah.
lang
Yeah.
doon pa lang unite and lobby for kung ano man
Right.
yung natin. There is a strong lobby group for Philippine interests in US Congress. Kailangan mo lang gagabayan, kailangan lang bibigyan ng kumpas.
Institutionalized,
Oo.
I think it's a perfect segue to the final part of this episode. Elections.
Yes.
The U.S. is going to have its elections soon, but just as the Americans are going to have their elections, our elections are going to also kick off for 2025 with the registration later this year. Before we go to your plans, you were actually among the first public figures who talked about realignments. You said nakakaroon ng realignment, especially nung naging klaro na si Pangulo Marcos Jr. is going to take a much more, let's say, mature and patriotic position in West Philippine Sea. Can you tell me a little bit about this realignment, and then how does this essentially feed into this emerging House of Marcos versus House of Duterte fight for the 2020? Because Duterte's look like the de facto opposition. The ratings are going, right?
Well, I think ideally, dapat may realignment na at ano na,
Right.
no? But meron kasing mga sentimentalities dito
Sure.
na may mga na-trauma during the Marcos years. Yung mga sinatawag mo ang Never Marcos group.
Versus never Duterte.
Oo,
Yeah.
yung Never Marcos group, they would rather um, stay in the middle, mag-fence it lang sila, and ano lang, no? Kahit sa kanila, matalo ng Duterte yung Marcos, okay lang sa kanila, no? But for the patriotic lot, hindi pwede yon. Ano ba yung national interest dito? National interest dito is matapos ni President Marcos yung term niya until 2028. Because if it gets cut short, and that would be a disaster kasi
Right.
Sara assumes as president, a pro-China president, tapos wala na naman to.
You think she
rules
will
na
be
naman.
like her father? Because there's some Americans would say, but she did IVLP program. Remember meron siyang interim, she's more balanced and more... I heard this from people in Washington, D.C. And like, I'm not sure. I mean, you read this, she will replicate her father. And perhaps more efficiently.
Well, that's what they said about Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, that they
Because
have,
they're exposed to the
Yeah,
West, they'll
West.
be... yeah.
okay, so I believe time and again hindi hindi assurance. Sara Duterte has given us a glimpse of her temperament, her personality, her character. I believe she would just be as bad as Duterte or probably even worse. Kasi iba to, short fuse ito, walang humor ito. Talagang out and out
Well, the former
tyrant
president
ito.
was quite a humorous guy. I would say
Yeah.
very dark, sometimes very wrong,
Yeah.
but he was humorous. But as far as her stance on the West Philippines is concerned, it's still no comment, right? I mean, sometimes I wonder, will ASEAN go ahead of our vice president saying something on West Philippine Sea? But, I mean, she hasn't said much on West Philippine Sea, so how can we say what's her position?
But that's a giveaway. If you're not commenting on the
bullying of the Philippines,
bullying
yeah.
of China, may problema doon. Ibig sabihin nun, you're favoring the bully. Tayo yung binubuli. That's so bad. It's a giveaway. Alam lang niya na there is a strong anti-China sentiment right now, and she doesn't want to be perceived as openly as pro-China. Pero at the same time, ayaw naman niyang mag-side dun sa anti-China position because yung mga patron niya, baka naman singilin siya.
Well, just to be clear, this is your claim, and we're not
Yeah,
endorsing that position. But, sir, do you think that these elections could be one whereby it could be like where foreign policy finally could become a central issue? Do you think that foreign powers could be involved directly in the upcoming elections, backing certain side against the other? Because I think while President Duterte recently said that he's not opposition in spite of everything he has said against the president. Some would say even incitement to rebellion. That looks like the fault run, right? Those who favor warm relations with China in spite of everything, and those who are saying, no, China is a #1 national security threat. We have to bring in our allies. We have to fight back against it. This could be do you expect there'll be some like Team Philippines versus Team China, or Team Peace versus Team War, right? Team Proxy War versus Team Independent Foreign Policy. Is this going to be one of the ways by which the election is going to go?
For sure, it's going to be used by the Marcos camp against the Duterte camp. But there would be other central issues that's going to be used, but that could be a deal breaker for some of the voters, because they would force these senators to make a stand. But knowing these candidates, eventually, when pressed to say what their position is, they will straddle between the two sides. But again, it's a propaganda game during elections, and the anti-China sentiment is very strong. If the Marcos administration or Marcos slate will use this against the Duterte administration, they will shave off a lot of votes against the Duterte candidates.
Last on this, of course, the one big factor or Deus Ex Machina, or whatever you want to look at it, is it could be the ICC issue, right? That could complicate the entire picture. That would bring a whole different dimension. I know you have your own understanding of where the direction of the ICC could go, but what are the scenarios you have in mind, and what do you think the administration should do? Because the president, fresh off from the United States, still during his inaugural talk with the FOCAP, with the journalists, foreign journalists in the Philippines, he said, no, walang jurisdiction ng ICC na yan. Still holding down the, holding the fort for President Duterte, in effect. And, despite the First Lady coming out, essentially guns blazing and saying, you're being extremely rude to the President, and the Vice President has to say something about what the former President is saying. It looks like President Marcos Jr. constantly is emphasizing united front, constantly saying unity and all of that. Is this like him being Machiavellian, like in a way smart and trying to avoid unnecessary confrontation while letting things, slow burn? Or is he being, I don't know, marupok, or lack of decisiveness? What is your understanding here?
Okay. I believe the president will say what he needs to say, but he will do
what he needs to do. Okay.
Okay. So, nakita na natin yan. Even in China, in the foreign policy issue, wala kang maririnig sa kanya na strong anti-China sentiment.
Right. Unlike President Aquino, right, who was very vocal. Yeah.
But then look at what's happening on the ground. So, ganun lang yon. That is more important. But, yun nga, very, siya doon. May message discipline siya. Okay? I'm not second-guessing na kung anong gagawin niya. But we'll see. Pag lumabas yung warrant, if the pressure is overwhelming domestically and internationally, yun yun.
And you think there will be clamor from friends and from folks for him to act upon it if there's an error?
At the bare minimum, Mr. Duterte will go underground. He's not going gallivanting around the country, knowing that there is an Interpol warrant against him. I don't think he's going to do that. He would probably do a kubuloy.
Yeah, so is he going to join his friend? I mean,
and the question is, what about the others? If the others will follow suit, that can be a game changer in the Senate race in 2025.
And where does that put Vice President Sara Duterte? Because I think, in fairness to her, she has tried to, walk a very fine line whereby no comment about what the First Lady is saying, no comment about what my father is saying. Whatever disagreement, we'll talk about this in private. I'm still part of the administration. I'm not going to resign. You think that's a sustainable strategy for her to essentially try to keep everyone who's trying to pull her out of the administration at bay?
I think at this point in time, the fate of Sara Duterte is in the hands of
President
Marcos. So regardless of what she says or does, it's what's going to happen will happen.
Of course, this is the most important part. Are you going to throw your own hat into the ring? Because, we're still wondering about your plans. You're very much out there. You're making suggestions. Some would say you're giving unsolicited advice about how other people should go. What about you? Are you going to throw your own hat into the ring?
Well, I intend to run for a local post. So that will give me the objectivity in proposing these suggestions on national issues. So it's a step back from the noise in the national picture.
You mean you're going to be independent in that sense, right? You're not going to be part of. You're going to run independent. Is that what you're saying here?
Not necessarily, but in the Philippine context, when you run for a local post, it's you're basically removed from the
national debate.
Divisions.
Right, and why local politics? Because you think you're closer to people and you can give services directly. Are you inspired by certain examples in recent years?
In a way, yes. That it's a policy making that's going to be affected directly by the people,
right.
And at the same time, I got burnt out during the last campaign.
Right.
It's very difficult to campaign in national elections if you don't have any money.
Right.
So we'd rather regroup in the local scene, particularly Caloocan City,
Right.
as mayor.
Although some would say maybe local is even more difficult than national sometimes, depending how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So you never know. Maybe next time we're going to have a conversation, we're going to call you Mayor Trillanes,
Yeah, we'll
right?
see, we'll
So
see.
hindi lang si Digong
Yeah.
ang mayor.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again,
you, Richard.
Senator, for that fantastic and thorough conversation. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Heydarian, and this is The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.